Welcome! In this series of videos, we will look at software add-ons for the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today we will look again at the MyLittleGrid custom grid and add images to the grid. This was our application at the end of the last video. We have a MyLittleGrid custom grid displayed on our dialog. Today we're going to look at MyLittleGrid's ability to store images within the grid itself. Perhaps the first question you may want to ask yourself is, why would I want to put an image on the grid? And what ability does MyLittleGrid have to store images? For this particular application, we may want to store additional information on each user. We may want to store a note against the user, allowing the user of the application to enter details against each individual user. And we want something on screen which will display to the person using the application that a user on this list of staff does have a note recorded against their name. So how can we do that? Let's have a look at the code. Our application at the moment reads a CSV file, datafile.csv, into the application, and this is what's used to populate the grid. At the moment, this CSV file has only a small number of columns. Now our CSV file has two additional columns. It has a note column which has a header of N for note, and it has a location column, and we've also added the employee number column. We're going to concentrate today on the content of the N column, or note column. Two of the users at the top of our user list have notes against them, and we want something displayed on the grid to indicate what these notes are. You may want to store notes which are several sentences long, and this would take up room on the grid. So what we're going to do is display a small image in a column to indicate that there is or isn't a note against that particular user. So we're also going to copy in a small bitmap. This bitmap is what we're going to use to populate the column inside our MyLittleGrid. Therefore, the first thing to do in our application is to store this notes bitmap within the application in a resource. So we're going to use a resource bitmap command. We'll give it the name notes, and we'll tell it that the bitmap we want to load is notes.bmp. When your application compiles, the bitmap will be embedded within the executable. As currently the note is in our CSV file, we don't want the text of the note appearing on the grid. So we'll need to store that somewhere else within the application. So we will set up a global array to hold these notes. And as well as a global array, we're going to set up a flag, a note active flag. This is going to be used to determine whether we're currently doing something with notes at that point in time. As you will remember from the last video, we defined the column names of our first sheet, our first tab in the grid, in a constant called column names. I've added on here 3 additional columns to match what's in the CSV file. An N column for notes, a location, and the employee number. I've also increased the number of column widths to define the width of each of these columns, and we've increased the maximum number of grid columns from 7 to 9. So if we run that code now, you will see our 3 new columns appearing on the grid. The text is currently appearing in the N column, we have the location, and we have the blank employee number column. So as part of loading this data, we have to perform a task to remove the text and to replace that with a bitmap. The function that loads the data into the CSV file is called loadTheData. This loads the CSV file first into an array, and then uses the mlg_putx command to take the entire array and put it onto the grid. We want to keep the efficiency of this mlg_putx command, but we want to do something after that's actually happened. So we're going to make use of some new macros in our MyLittleGrid Lite library. First of all, we'll set up some local variables, which I will explain as we go along. You can store 15 different types of bitmap on our grid. So we're going to give them a slot number. We're going to populate the very first slot to register our bitmap against the grid. and we're going to make use of one of our macros. This macro, called register bitmap on grid, takes three parameters: the grid handle, the slot number, which we've currently populated as slot number 1, and the name of our resource that we want to put into the grid, in this case notes, which is our notes bitmap. We can then use our existing function to get the column number of the n column, and since we've already populated the grid, we'll know how many rows are in it using the getRowsInGrid function. Having got this far, we now have to store any notes that are in the grid already into our global notes array. This can be done with a simple for next loop. We are redimensioning the notes array for the total number of rows in our grid. And then for each of those rows, we're picking up the value in the notes column using the standard mlg get command, which is inbuilt to the grid itself. So having stored all our notes, we can now sweep through all the rows in the grid and blank out the text that's in the n column, the notes column. So for each of these rows, we're going to get the value that's in the grid column using mlg get. And if it is not blank, then we want to blank out the value that's in that grid cell. We can do that using mlg put. Again, it takes 5 parameters: the grid, the row number, the column number, the value you wish to put into the cell, and either a 0 or a 1 to define whether the grid is to be refreshed right away or to wait till later. OnRefresh currently holds the value 0, which means we will not redraw the grid at this point. This speeds up the performance of MyLittleGrid considerably. Now that we've determined that there is actually a note in this cell, we want to assign our bitmap to the cell, and we're going to be using another of our new macros. This one, called assign bitmap to cell, takes 4 parameters: the grid handle, the row number, the column number, and the slot that we have pre-registered, slot number 1, that we wish to put into the grid as a bitmap. We will fill in the else statement in a few moments. So at the end of our for next loop, we will use a grid refresh command to refresh the grid completely. If we try running that code now, we will see that 2 of the records on our grid do indeed now have a small bitmap on them. As the bitmap is stored in a file, you can basically make up any bitmap you like to fit into the grid. Now that we've identified which users have actually got notes against them, we'll want the user to be able to actually look at the note and either erase the note, edit it, or create a note where there isn't one already. So in order to do this, we'll need to handle the event within our event handler function. So here we have the code, which is the event handler for our MyLittleGrid. The last event we added was the one that handled changing the tab or the sheet. Now we're going to handle something which is the clicking or selection of our note cell. And we're going to use a new event called mlgn select change. 2 parameters come out of this. One is the previous row and the previous column. While it's quite useful to know what was the previously selected one before you selected this one, what we want to find out here is the currently selected row and column, and there's another function in the library we can make use of to populate these values. And that's getSelectedRowColumn. It takes 3 parameters. The input parameter is the handle for the grid, and the output parameters are the row and the column. We'll want to know whether the user has actually clicked on our notes column. So we're going to use the static variable on this function to set this up when the dialog is initially displayed to the user. So we're adding 2 new variables at the top, a static variable for the notes column number and a slot, which is going to be the slot number for our bitmap. So in the initialization section of this event handler, we're going to pick up what the notes column actually is using our getColumnNumber. As we're using this variable in its static mode, it means once we populate this, it will always be populated for the duration of the run of the application. So we can now test whether the column clicked on is indeed the notes column or not, by the use of a simple if statement. If the column selected is our notes column, and we're also going to be using the long noteActive global variable to determine whether the note is already actively shown on screen. If the column number matches the notes column and the note active is false, then we know the user has selected the column and we can now proceed to show the user's note. We will first set the note active to true. We'll want to display a small dialog on screen to show to the user of our application what the note actually is. So we're going to create a new dialog. We'll do that in a moment, but we'll call it Show Notes. We're going to be passing this dialog some extra parameters. Normally we would just pass the handle of the payment dialog, CBHNDL. But we're also passing the value that's in the global array for notes, just in case there's an existing note. And we're also passing the row that we've clicked on in the grid. So let's create this new dialog. So here is our little dialog. There's not a great deal to this dialog. It has a text box to display the notes itself. It has a button to save the value, and we're taking that save as an OK default button. So we try running our application now. Our grid will display. If we click on one of our notes, it will display the new dialog, and it's pre-populated with the value we had in that note. If we click on one of the ones that does not have a note currently, it would appear as blank. So we have quite successfully managed to display a note graphically using a bitmap on the grid. And in clicking on that, we can now display a second dialog containing the details of the note. Next, we want to actually take the value that user is going to key into this notes dialog and save that back to the global array. And also, if no note existed before, we want to put a small bitmap into the n column on the grid. So we need to handle this when this dialog is actually clicked on for the save button. So in the callback function for that dialog, our event handler, we have an event called IDOK, which is our save button. If that button is clicked, we're doing something to get this back. One additional thing we've actually done in the little save dialog is how we've stored the row number. As you'll see, we passed in our three parameters: the handle of the payment dialog, the text to appear in the text box, and the row number. We have populated the text box with the value of our notes variable, and we're using one of the features of the dialog to set a user number, which is number 1, for the value of the row. In Power Basic, dialogs can hold 8 separate values on the dialog. These are all long numbers and are very useful for setting numeric values. If we have a look at the event handler for the notes dialog, we'll see that when the user clicks on the save button, the first thing we do is to pull back from the user setting for slot number 1 the value of the row. We can then get the text from the text box to a text variable, and we can populate the global array for the row number with the text the user's actually typed in. And then we can return to our calling dialog. So if we have a look at the calling dialog, here is where we called the notes dialog. When the user exits that dialog, then the next line of code will be this one here, to deactivate the note. Now we can determine whether the user actually did update the global notes array or not. We're going to do that with a straightforward select case statement. If the value of the row in the notes array is blank, then the user has either decided not to save a note or has blanked out an existing note. If the note has got something in it, then we'll want to mark the grid with our bitmap. So as we did before, we can use the slot number to define which bitmap we're going to be using. Of the 15 bitmaps we could be using, at the moment we're only using the one. So using the assign bitmap to cell will update that cell on the grid with our bitmap. So let's try that code now. If we pick one that does not yet have a note, type a note in, hit the save button, and our icon appears. However, if we pick one that has a note already and attempt to blank that out, we have now removed the note, hit the save button, but the icon remains. The bitmap has not been removed. So how do we remove a bitmap that we've already placed on the grid? For this case, the value in the global array would be blank, a zero-length string. We're going to use another one of our macros to change the type of the cell. This one takes the standard three parameters, the grid handle, the row number and the column number, and the final parameter is MLG type edit. This changes the type of the grid cell from being a cell that a bitmap can exist in to being a standard text edit box. And then we can quite simply call the grid refresh function. If we run that code now, and we pick one of the notes that already exists, we take the text out and hit the save button, then our icon disappears. So if we try another one, put some text in, our icon is appearing quite happily. And anyone we want to blank out, if we take the text out, hit the save button, the icon will disappear. So what we've achieved today is a mechanism by which we can use the graphic abilities of our grid to store a bitmap. And that bitmap can indicate that there is further information available on this particular entry on the grid. And we're using our event handler of the grid to allow the user to select, and we can trigger the launch of another dialog. While we're using this for a simple piece of text entry, clicking this could give us a dialog with many fields on it. So you could have a summary of information in the grid, and the detail information could be accessible using this approach. Hopefully you'll find this code useful in your applications, but that's it for today. Thank you for watching.